On Contradiction by Mao Zedong, published August 1937. The law of contradiction in things, that is, the law of the unity of opposites, is the basic law of materialist dialectics. Lenin said, quote, "Dialectics in the proper sense is the study of contradiction in the very essence of objects," end quote. Lenin often called this the essence of dialectics. He also called it the kernel of dialectics. In studying this law, therefore, we cannot but touch upon a variety of questions, upon a number of philosophical problems. If we can become clear on all these problems, we shall arrive at a fundamental understanding of materialist dialectics. The problems are the two world outlooks, the universality of contradiction, the particularity of contradiction, the principle of contradiction, and the principal aspect of a contradiction, the identity and struggle of the aspects of a contradiction, and the place of antagonism in contradiction. The criticism to which the idealism of the De Born school has been subjected in Soviet philosophical circles in recent years has aroused great interest among us. De Born's idealism has exerted a very bad influence in the Chinese Communist Party, and it cannot be said that the dogmatist thinking in our party is unrelated to the approach of that school. Our present study of philosophy should therefore have the eradication of dogmatist thinking as its main objective. So, a little side note, De Born was an idealist philosopher who clashed heads with Stalin over dialectical and historical materialism and was therefore suppressed during the Stalin period, and he would be revived during the Khrushchev period, which should give you all you need to know about his idealism and distortion of Marxism. 1. The two world outlooks. Throughout the history of human knowledge, there have been two conceptions concerning the law of development of the universe: the metaphysical conception and the dialectical conception, which form two opposing world outlooks. Lenin said, the two basic, or two possible, or two historically observable conceptions of development, or evolution, are development as decrease and increase, as repetition, and development as the unity of opposites, the division of a unity into mutually exclusive opposites, and the reciprocal relation. Here Lenin was referring to these two different world outlooks. In Chinese, another name for metaphysics is Hassan Hashish. For a long period in history, whether in China or in Europe, this way of thinking, which is part and parcel of the idealist world outlook, occupied a dominant position in human thought. In Europe, the materialism of the bourgeoisie in its earliest days was also metaphysical. As the social economy of many European countries advanced to a stage of highly developed capitalism, as the forces of production, the class struggle, and the sciences developed to a level of unprecedented in history, and as the industrial proletariat became the greatest motive force in historical development, there arose the Marxist world outlook of materialist dialectics, over the metaphysical, that is. Then, in addition to open and barefaced reactionary idealism, vulgar evolutionism emerged among the bourgeois to oppose materialist dialectics. But what Mao is identifying here is that all throughout human history, there have been two competing theories. One is idealism, and this has mostly been pushed by the ruling classes, and the other is materialism. And this is the ideology of the working class, and it was only really able to be formulated in highly developed capitalism with a scientific world outlook as discovered or, really formulated by Marx and Engels. Idealism's big error is that it sees the world as coming from man's thoughts. Materialism uses the physical world as the basis for analysis. The metaphysical or vulgar evolutionist world outlook sees things as isolated, static, and one-sided. It regards all things in the universe, their forms, and their species as eternally isolated from one another and immutable. Such change as there is can only be an increase or decrease in quantity or change of a place. Moreover, the cause of such an increase or decrease or change of a place is not inside things, but outside them. That is, the motive force is external. Metaphysicians hold that all different kinds of things in the universe and all their characteristics have been the same ever since they first came into being. All subsequent changes have simply been, increases or decreases in quantity. They contend that a thing can only keep on repeating itself as the same kind of thing and cannot change into anything different. In their opinion, capitalist exploitation, capitalist competition, the individualistic ideology of capitalist society, and so on can be found in ancient slave society or even primitive society and will exist forever unchanged. So this again is idealism. You'll often hear liberals say, oh, capitalism has always existed. Humanity is capitalist. They essentially take their ideology, and they use it as the foundation of the world. Marxists, they take economic relations, they take the world around them and use that through materialism as their foundation for analysis. And so Marxists are able to recognize that, in fact, humanity was not capitalist until very recently. It's gone through several different modes of production, primitive communist to slave society to feudalism to then capitalism. They ascribe the causes of social development to factors external to society, such as geography and climate. They search in an oversimplified way outside a thing for the causes of its development, then deny the theory of Marx's materialist dialectics, which holds that development arises from the conditions inside a thing. Consequently, they can explain neither the qualitative diversity of things nor the phenomenon of quality changing into another. In Europe, this mode of thinking existed as mechanical materialism in the 17th and 18th century and as vulgar evolutionism at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. In China, there was metaphysical thinking exemplified in the saying, "Heaven changeth not, like Tao changeth not," and it was supported by the decadent feudal ruling classes for a long time. Mechanical materialism and vulgar evolutionism, which were imported from Europe in the last 100 years, are supported by the bourgeois. So I'll give you an example of what separates idealist thinking and materialist thinking. An idealist would say that the American Revolution happened because George Washington loved freedom. A materialist would say that the American Revolution happened because there was an economic motivation for it to happen. For example, the slave-owning classes wanted to protect their slavery and to expand more into past the Appalachian Mountains. So one historian, he says it happened because of ideas, because of love for liberty. Another says it happened because of economic motivations. It happened because of things like that. So that's the difference between materialism and idealism. And idealism is an idea that is inherently pushed by the ruling classes of almost every single society. Because if we get a materialist world outlook, suddenly we realize capitalism is not permanent. There's nothing special about capitalism. Humanity's gone through many different modes of production. And in fact, there's many laws to capitalism that make it temporary. And so materialism is a very inherently liberating philosophy, and that's why they want us to remain idealists, stuck in thoughts. You can think of fascism, you can think of racism as idealist ideas that are pushed onto us by the ruling classes. As opposed to the metaphysical world outlook, the world outlook of materialist dialectics holds that in order to understand the development of a thing, we should study it internally and in relations with other things. In other words, the development of things should be seen as their internal and necessarily self-movement, while each thing in its movement is interrelated with and interacts on the other things around it. The fundamental cause of development of a thing is not external, but internal. It lies in the contradictoriness within the thing. There is internal contradiction in every single thing, hence its motion and development. Contradictoriness within a thing is the fundamental cause of its development, while its interrelations and interactions with other things are secondary causes. Thus, materialist dialectics effectively combats the theory of external causes, or of an external motive force, advanced by the metaphysical, mechanical materialism, and vulgar evolutionism. It is evident that purely external causes can only give rise to mechanical motion, that is, to changes in scale or quantity, but cannot explain why things differ qualitatively in thousands of ways, and why one thing changes into another. As a matter of fact, even mechanical motion under external forces occurs through the internal contradictoriness of things. simple growth in plants and animals, their quantitative development is likewise chiefly the result of their internal contradictions. Similarly, social development is due chiefly not to external but to internal causes. Countries with the same geographical and climatical conditions display a great diversity and unevenness in their development. Moreover, great social changes may take place in one and the same country, although its geography and climate remain unchanged. Imperialist Russia changed into the Socialist Soviet Union, and feudal Japan, which had locked its doors against the world, changed into imperialist Japan, although no change occurred in geography and climate of either country. Long dominated by feudalism, China has undergone great changes in the last 100 years and is now changing in the direction of a new China, liberated and free, and yet no change has occurred in her geography and climate. Changes do not take place in the geography and climate of the earth as a whole and in every part of it, but they are insignificant when compared with changes in society. Geographical and climatic changes manifest themselves in terms of tens and thousands of years, while social changes manifest themselves in thousands, hundreds, or tens of years, and even in a few years or months in times of revolution. According to materialist dialectics, changes in nature are due chiefly to the development of the internal contradictions in nature. Changes in society are due chiefly to the development of the internal contradictions in society. That is, the contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production, the contradiction between classes, and the contradiction between old and new. It is the development of these contradictions that pushes society forward and gives the impetus for the supersession of the old society by the new. Does materialist dialectics exclude external causes? No, not at all. It holds that the external causes are the condition of change and internal causes are the basis of change, and that external causes become operative through internal causes. In a suitable temperature, an egg changes into a chicken, but no temperature can change a stone into a chicken, because each has a different basis. I think that's like a really good example for understanding the laws of contradiction. So what Mao is basically saying here is that every single human society has contradictions within its systems, and the way that these contradictions play out is what causes change. He also roots contradiction as a universal law that is rooted in science, such as chemistry. A chemical changes into another chemical. Math, for example, you change a number from another number using its own internal laws, right? So human societies have their own internal laws, and contradictions are the basis of these laws. Idealists, they simply just say, the reason that a place is the way it is because of the temperature, because of the geography. But as you can see, there's many different human societies, as Mao points out, with similar climates, with similar geographies. What really spurs changes within these societies is how their human societies operated, right? So he's being materialist, looking at the world outside of them, their economies, the workings of these economies, the relations of production, right? How their class society was organized, and how these classes interacted with each other. There is constant interaction between the peoples of different countries. In the era of capitalism, and especially in the era of imperialism and proletarian revolution, the interaction and mutual impact of different countries in the political, economic, and cultural spheres are extremely great. The October Socialist Revolution ushered in a new epoch in world history, as well as the Russian history. It exerted influence on internal changes in the other countries in the world, and similarly, in the particularly profound way, on the internal changes in China. These changes in China, however, were affected through the inner laws of development of these countries. In battle, one army is victorious and the other is defeated. Both the victory and the defeat are determined by internal causes. The one is victorious either because it is strong or because it is competent in generalship. The other is vanquished either because it is weak or because of its incompetent generalship. It is through internal causes that external causes become operative. In China in 1927, the defeat of the proletariat by the big bourgeoisie came through the opportunism then to be found within the Chinese proletariat itself, inside the Chinese Communist Party. When we liquidated this opportunism, the Chinese Revolution resumed its advance. Later, the Chinese Revolution again suffered a severe setback at the hands of the enemy, because adventurism had risen within our party. When we liquidated this adventurism, our cause advanced once again. Thus it can be seen that to lead the revolution to victory, a political party must depend on the correctness of its own political line and the solidarity of its own organization. The dialectical outlook emerged in ancient times, both in China and in Europe. Ancient dialectics, however, was somewhat spontaneous and naive in character. In the social and historical conditions then prevailing, it was not yet able to form a theoretical system. Hence, it could not fully explain the world and was supplanted by metaphysics. The famous German philosopher Hegel, who lived in the 18th and 19th centuries, made the most important contributions to dialectics, but his dialectics was idealist. It was not until Marx and Engels, the great protagonists of the proletarian movement, had synthesized the positive achievements in the history of human knowledge, and in particular, critically absorbed the rational elements of Hegelian dialectics and created the great theory of dialectical and historical materialism, that an unprecedented revolution occurred in the history of human knowledge. This theory was further developed by Lenin and Stalin. As soon as it spread to China, it wrought tremendous change in the world of Chinese thought. The dialectical world outlook teaches us primarily how to understand and analyze the movement of opposites in different things, and, on the basis of such analysis, to indicate the method for resolving contradictions. It is therefore most important for us to understand the law of contradictions in things in a concrete way. 2. The universality of contradiction. For convenience of exposition, I shall deal first with the universality of contradiction, and then proceed to the particularity of contradiction. The reason is that the universality of contradiction can be explained more briefly, for it has been widely recognized ever since the materialist dialectical world outlook was discovered, and the materialist dialectics applied with outstanding success to analyzing many aspects of human history and natural history, and to changing many aspects of society and nature, as in the Soviet Union, by the great creators and continuers of Marxism, Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin. Whereas the particularity of contradiction is still not dearly understood by many comrades, especially by the dogmatists. They do not understand that it is precisely in the particularity of contradiction that the universality of contradiction resides, nor do they understand how important is the study of the particularity of contradiction in the more concrete things confronting us for guiding the course of revolutionary practice. Therefore, it is necessary to stress the study of the particularity of contradiction and to explain it at adequate length. For this reason, in our analysis of the law of contradiction in things, we shall first analyze the universality of contradiction, then place special stress on analyzing the particularity of contradiction, and finally return to the universality of contradiction. The universality of absoluteness of contradiction has twofold meanings. One is that contradiction exists in the process of development of all things, and the other is that in the process of development of each thing, a movement of opposites exists from beginning to end. Engels said, "Motion itself is a contradiction." Lenin defined the law of the unity of opposites as the recognition, or discovery, of the contradictory, mutually exclusive, opposite tendencies in all phenomena and processes of nature, including mind and society. Are these correct ideas? Yes, they are. The interdependence of the contradictory aspects present in all things and the struggle between these aspects determine the life of all things and push their development forward. There is nothing that does not contain contradiction. Without contradiction, nothing would exist. Contradiction is the basis of the simple forms of motion, for instance, mechanical motion, and still more so of the complex forms of motion. Engels explained the universality of contradiction as follows. If simple mechanical change of a place contains a contradiction, this is even more true of the higher forms of life, of motion of matter, and especially of organic life and its development. Life consists precisely and primarily in this, that a being is at each moment itself and yet something else. Life is therefore a contradiction which presents in things and processes themselves, and which constantly originates and resolves itself. And as soon as the contradiction ceases, life too comes to an end, and death steeps in. We likewise saw that also in the sphere of thought we could not escape contradictions, and that, for example, the contradiction between man's inherently unlimited capacity for knowledge and its actual presence only in men who are externally limited and possess limited cognition finds its solution in what is, at least practically for us, an endless succession of generations in infinite progress. One of the basis principles of higher mathematics is the contradiction that in certain circumstances, straight lines and curves may become the same. But even lower mathematics teems with contradictions. Lenin illustrated the universality of contradictions as follows. In math, plus and minus, differential and integral. In mechanics, action and reaction. In physics, positive and negative electricity. In chemistry, the combination and dissociation of atoms. In social science, the class struggle. End quote. In war, offense, defense, advance, retreat, victory, and defeat are all mutually contradictory phenomena. One cannot exist without the other. The two aspects are at once in conflict and interdependence, and this constitutes the totality of war, pushes its development forward, and solves its problems. Every difference in men's conceptions should be regarded as reflecting an objective contradiction. Objective contradictions are reflected in the subjective thinking, and this process constitutes the contradictory movement of concepts, pushes forward the development of thought, and ceaselessly solves problems in man's thinking. Opposition and struggle between ideas of a different kinds constantly occur within the party. This is a reflection within the party of contradictions between classes and between the new and old in society. If there were no contradictions in the party, and no ideological struggles to resolve them, the party's life would come to an end. Thus, it is already clear that contradiction exists universally, and in all processes, whether in the simple or in the complex forms of motion, whether in the objective phenomenon or ideological phenomenon. But does contradiction also exist at the initial stage of each process? Is there a movement of opposites from beginning to end in the process of development of every single thing? As can be seen from the articles written by Soviet philosophers criticizing it, the de Boron school maintains that contradiction appears not at the inception of a process, but only when it is developed to a certain stage. Again, remember, de Boron was that idealist who was suppressed by the USSR. If this were the case, then the cause of the development of the process before that stage would be external and not internal. De Boron thus reverts to the metaphysical theories of external causality and of mechanism. Applying this view in analysis of concrete problems, the de Boron school sees only differences but not contradictions between the kulaks and the peasants in general under existing conditions in the Soviet Union, thus entirely agreeing with Bukharin. In analyzing the French Revolution, it holds that before the Revolution, there was likewise only differences but not contradictions with the Third Estate, which was composed of workers, the peasants, and the bourgeois. These views of the de Boron school are anti-Marxist. This school does not understand that each and every difference already contains contradiction, and that difference itself is contradiction. Labor and capital have been in contradiction ever since the two classes came into being. Only at first the contradiction had not yet become intense. Even under the social conditions existing in the Soviet Union, there is a difference between workers and peasants, and this very difference is a contradiction. Although unlike the contradiction between labor and capital, it will not become intensified into antagonism or assume the form of class struggle. The workers and the peasants have established a firm alliance in the course of socialist construction and are gradually resolving this contradiction in the course of the advance from socialism to communism. The question is one of different kinds of contradiction, not of the presence or absence of contradiction. Contradiction is universal and absolute. It is present in the process of the development of all things and permeates every process from beginning to end. What is meant by the emergence of a new process? The old unity with its constituent opposites yields to a new unity with its constituent opposites, whereupon a new process emerges to replace the old. The old process ends and a new one begins. The new process contains new contradictions and begins its own history of the development of contradictions. As Lenin pointed out, Marx in his Capital gave a model analysis of this movement of opposites, which runs through the process of the development of things from the beginning to the end. This is the method that must be employed in studying the development of all things. Lenin, too, employed this method correctly and adhered to it in all his writings. In his Capital, Marx first analyzes the simplest, most ordinary and fundamental, most common in the everyday relation of bourgeois commodity society, a relation encountered billions of times, viz. The exchange of commodities. In this very simple phenomenon, in this cell of bourgeois society, analysis reveals all contradictions, or all germs of the contradictions of modern society. The subsequent exposition shows us the development, both growth and movement, of these contradictions and of this society in the summation of its individual parts from beginning to its end. Lenin added, such must also be the method of exposition or study of dialectics in general. End quote. Chinese communists must learn this method. Only then will they be able to correctly analyze history and the present state of the Chinese Revolution and infer its future. 3. The particularity of contradiction. Contradiction is present in the process of the development of all things. It permeates the process of development of each thing from beginning to end. This is the universality and absoluteness of contradiction, which we have discussed above. Now let us discuss the particularity and relativity of contradiction. This problem should be studied on several levels. First, the contradiction in each form of motion of matter has its particularity. Man's knowledge of matter is knowledge of its forms of motion, because there is nothing in this world except matter in motion, and this motion must assume certain forms. In considering each form of motion of matter, we must observe the points which it has in common with other forms of motion. But what is especially important and necessary, constituting as it does the foundation of our knowledge of a thing, is to observe what is particular to this form of motion of matter, namely to observe the qualitative difference between this form of motion and other forms. Only when we have done so can we distinguish between things. Every form of motion contains within itself its own particular contradiction. This particular contradiction constitutes the particular essence which distinguishes one thing from another. It is the eternal cause, or as it may be called, the basis for the immense variety of things in the world. There are many forms of motion in nature: mechanical motion, sound, light, heat, electricity, dissociation, combination, and so on. All these forms are interdependent, but in its essence, each is different from the others. The particular essence of each form of motion is determined by its own particular contradiction. This holds true not only for nature, but also for social and ideological phenomena. Every form of society, every form of ideology, has its own particular contradiction and particular essence. So do you see there how Mao connects Marxism to science itself and universal laws? That's because Marxism is a science. That's what dialectical materialism does. That's what we do when we analyze contradictions. Just like chemistry has contradictions, like, you mix two chemicals together and it creates a chemical reaction. Human society also has these, chemicals within it, and these contradictions combine together and move human society forward. Within our current epoch of society, that's class contradiction, especially between the bourgeois and the proletariat. The sciences are differentiated precisely on the basis of the particular contradictions inherent in their respective objects of study. Thus, the contradiction particular to a certain field of phenomenon constitutes the object of study of a specific branch of science. For example, positive and negative numbers in mathematics, action and reaction in mechanics, positive and negative electricity in physics, dissociation and combination in chemistry, forces of production and relations of production. So forces of production is technological advancement. So you can be like a hunter-gatherer society, with arrows, spears, some little bit of agriculture maybe. And then you could be an industrial behemoth society, right? So those are your forces of production. Relations of production is how these technologies are organized. So what are the class relations? Who owns the means of production? Things like that. Classes and class struggle. In social science, offense and defense in military science, idealism and materialism, the metaphysical outlook and the dialectical outlook in philosophy, and so on. All of these are the objects of study of different branches of science precisely because each branch has its own particular contradiction and particular essence. Of course, unless we understand the universality of contradiction, we have no way of discovering the universal cause or universal basis for the movement or development of things. However, unless we study the particularity of contradiction, we have no way of determining the particular essence of a thing which differentiates it from other things. No way of discovering the particular cause or the particular basis for the movement or development of a thing, and no way of distinguishing one thing from another or of demarcating the fields of science. As regards the sequence in the movement of man's knowledge, there is always a gradual growth from the knowledge of the individual and particular things to the knowledge of things in general. Only after man knows the particular essence of many different things can he proceed to generalization and know the common essence of things. When man attains knowledge of this common essence, he uses it as a guide and proceeds to study various concrete things which have not been yet studied or studied thoroughly and to discover the particular essence of each. Only thus is he able to supplement, enrich, and develop his knowledge of their common essence and prevent such knowledge from withering or petrifying. These are the two processes of cognition, one from the particular to the general, and the other from the general to the particular. Thus, cognition always moves in cycles, as long as the scientific method is strictly adhered to. Each cycle advances human knowledge a step higher, and so makes it more and more profound. Where our dogmatists err on this question is that, on one hand, they do not understand that we have to study the particularity of contradiction and know the particular essence of the individual things before we can adequately know the universality of contradiction and the common essence of things. And that, on the other hand, they do not understand that after knowing the common essence of things, we must go further and study the concrete things that have not yet been thoroughly studied or have only just been emerged. Our dogmatists are lazy bones. They refuse to undertake any painstaking study of concrete things. They regard general truths as emerging out of the void. They turn them into purely abstract, unfathomable formulas, and thereby completely deny and reverse the normal sequence by which man comes to know truth. Nor do they understand the interconnection between two processes in cognition, from particular to the general, and then from the general to the particular. They understand nothing of the Marxist theory of knowledge. As a materialist, the Marxist theory of knowledge always begins from the material world and then goes to ideology. Ultimately, in Marxism, consciousness itself, human consciousness, is just a reflection of the material world around us, and that is always the basis of our analyses, whether that's the economies around us, human societies, class relations, how these are interconnected, things like that. It is necessary not only to study the particular contradiction and essence determined thereby of every great system of forms of motion of matter, but also to study the particular contradiction and the essence of each process in the long course of development of each form of motion of matter. In every form of motion, each process of development, which is real and not imaginary, is qualitatively different. Our study must emphasize and start from this point. Qualitatively different contradictions can only be resolved by qualitatively different methods. For instance, the contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeois is resolved by the method of socialist revolution. The contradiction between the great masses of the people and the feudal system is resolved by a method of democratic revolution. The contradiction between the colonies and imperialism is resolved by the method of national revolutionary war. The contradiction between the working class and the peasant class in socialist society is resolved by the method of collectivization and mechanization in agriculture. The contradiction within the Communist Party is resolved by the method of criticism and self-criticism. The contradiction between society and nature is resolved by the method of developing the productive forces. Processes change. Old processes and old contradictions disappear. New processes and new contradictions emerge, and the methods of resolving contradictions differ accordingly. In Russia, there was a fundamental difference between the contradiction resolved by the February Revolution and the contradiction resolved by the October Revolution, as well as between the methods used to resolve them. The principle of using different methods to resolve different contradictions is one of which Marxist-Leninists must strictly observe. The dogmatists do not observe this principle. They do not understand that the conditions differ in different kinds of revolution, and so do not understand the different methods that should be used to resolve different contradictions. On the contrary, they invariably adopt what they imagine to be an unalterable formula and arbitrarily apply it everywhere, which only causes setbacks to the revolution or makes a sorry mess of what was originally well done. And, that is really why dogmatism is such a dangerous phenomenon. I mean, every body that we lose to left communism or other variants like that is another revolutionary body lost to an absurd intellectual masturbation that doesn't really affect the material world, which is the goal of Marxism. And this is not to throw out the importance of theory as a guiding practice, but, as Marxists, your ultimate goal should be to change the world. In order to reveal the particularity of the contradictions in any process in the development of a thing in their totality or their interconnections, that is, in order to reveal the essence of the process, it is necessary to reveal the particularity of two aspects of each of the contradictions in that process. Otherwise, it will be impossible to discover the essence of the process. This likewise requires the utmost attention in our study. There are many contradictions in the course of the development of any major thing. For instance, in the course of China's bourgeois democratic revolution, where the contradictions are exceedingly complex, there exists the contradiction between all oppressed classes in Chinese society and imperialism, the contradiction between the great masses of the people and feudalism, the contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeois, the contradiction between the peasantry and the petty urban petty bourgeois on the one hand and the bourgeois on the other, the contradiction between the various reactionary ruling groups, and so on. These contradictions cannot be treated in the same way since each has its own particularity. Moreover, two aspects of each contradiction cannot be treated in the same way since each aspect has its own characteristics. Who are we, engaged in the Chinese Revolution, should not only understand the particularity of these contradictions in their totality, that is, in their interconnections, but should also study the two aspects of each contradiction as the only means of understanding the totality. When we speak of understanding each aspect of a contradiction, we mean understanding what specific position each aspect occupies, what concrete forms it assumes in its interdependence and its contradiction with its opposite, and what concrete methods are employed in the struggle with its opposite, when the two are both interdependent and in contradiction, and also after the interdependence breaks down. It is of course great importance to study these problems. Lenin meant just this when he said that the most essential thing in Marxism, the living soul of Marxism, is the concrete analysis of concrete conditions. Our dogmatists have violated Lenin's teachings. They never use their brains to analyze anything concretely, and in their writings and speeches they always use stereotypes devoid of content, thereby creating a very bad style of work in our party. And so these really are the two errors that you really want to avoid. One is practice that is blind, guided without theory. And the other is being so lost in theory without a concrete analysis of the world that you sort of become a dogmatist that's unable to actually bring that theory into actuality. And some people actually become very proud of being dogmatists. It sort of becomes a little cultish movement for them. Bordiga, who's probably the principal dogmatist in the Marxist movements, especially, Leninism. He himself said that, in response to Mao's critiques of dogmatism, he himself said that Mao calls dogmatism bullshit. Well, bon appetit, almost as to say he loves eating bullshit or dogmatism. So some people become very proud of being lost and unable to change the world. But really a good communist job is to should maintain that balance between theory and practice and bring your theory into actuality. I mean, Marxism's goal is to change the world, not to interpret it. In studying a problem, we must shun objectivity, one-sidedness, and superficiality. To be subjective means not to look at a problem objectively, that is, not to use the materialist viewpoint in looking at problems. I have discussed this in my essay on practice. To be one-sided means not to look at problems all-sidedly. For example, to understand only China but not Japan, only the Communist Party but not the Kuomintang, only the proletariat but not the bourgeois, only the peasants but not the landlords, only the favorable conditions but not the difficult ones, only the past but not the future, only the individual parts but not the whole, only the defects but not the achievements, only the plaintiff's case and not the defendant's, only underground revolutionary work but not open revolutionary work, and so on. In a word, it means not to understand the characteristics of both aspects of a contradiction. This is what we mean by looking at a problem one-sidedly, or it may be called seeing the part but not the whole, seeing the trees but not the forest. That way, it is impossible to find the method for resolving a contradiction. It is impossible to accomplish the tasks of a revolution, to carry out the assignments well, or to develop the inter-party ideological struggle correctly. When Sun Wu-tzu said in discussing military science, quote, "Know your enemy and know yourself, and you can fight 100 battles with no danger of defeat," he was referring to two sides in a battle. Wei Chang of the Tang dynasty also understood the error of one-sidedness when he said, "Listen to both sides, and you will be enlightened. Heed only one side, and you will be benighted," end quote. But our comrades often look at problems one-sidedly, and so they often run into snags. In the novel Shu Hu Chuan, Song Qiang thrice attacked Chu village. Twice he was defeated because he was ignorant of the local conditions and used the wrong method. Later he changed his method. First he investigated the situation, and he familiarized himself with the maze of roads. Then he broke up the alliance between Lu, Hu, and the Chu villages, and sent his men in disguise into the enemy camp to lie in wait, using the stratagem similar to that of the Trojan horse in the foreign story. And on that third occasion he won. There are many examples of materialistic dialectics in Shu Hu Chuan, of which the episode of the 3 attacks on the Chu village is the best one. Lenin said, "In order really to know an object, we must embrace study, all of its sides, all connections and mediations. We shall never achieve this completely, but demand for all-sidedness is a safeguard against mistakes and rigidity," end quote. We should remember his words. To be superficial means to consider neither the characteristics of a contradiction in its totality, nor the characteristics of each of its aspects. It means to deny the necessity for probing deeply into a thing and minutely studying the characteristics of its contradiction, but instead merely to look from afar after glimpsing the rough outline, immediately to try to resolve the contradiction. This way of doing things is bound to lead to trouble. The reason the dogmatists and the empiricist comrades in China have made mistakes lies precisely in their subjectivist, one-sided, and superficial ways of looking at things. To be one-sided and superficial is at the same time to be subjective. For all objects, things are actually interconnected and are governed by inner laws, but instead of undertaking the task of reflecting things as they really are, some people only look at things one-sidedly or superficially, and who know neither their interconnectedness nor their inner laws, and so their method is subjectivist. Not only does the whole process of the movement of opposites in the development of a thing, both in their interconnections and in each aspect, have particular features to which we must give attention, but each stage in the process has its particular features to which we must give attention too. The fundamental contradiction in the process of development of a thing and the essence of process determined by this fundamental contradiction will not disappear until the process is completed. But a lengthy process, the conditions usually differ at each stage. The reason is that although the nature of the fundamental contradiction in the process of development of a thing and the essence of the process remain unchanged, the fundamental contradiction becomes more and more intensified as it passes from one stage to another in the lengthy process. In addition, among numerous major and minor contradictions, which are determined or influenced by the fundamental contradiction, some become intensified, some are temporarily or partially resolved or mitigated, and new ones emerge. Hence, the process is marked by stages. If people do not pay attention to the stages in the process of the development of a thing, they cannot deal with its contradictions properly. For instance, when the capitalism of the free competition developed into imperialism, there was no change in the class nature of the two classes in fundamental contradiction, namely the proletariat and the bourgeois, or in the capitalist essence of society. However, the contradiction between these two classes became intensified. The contradiction between monopoly and non-monopoly capital emerged. The contradiction between colonial powers and the colonies became intensified. The contradiction amongst the capitalist countries resulting from uneven development manifested with particular sharpness. And thus, there arose in the special stage of capitalism, the stage of imperialism. Leninism is Marxism of the era of imperialism and proletarian revolution, precisely because Lenin and Stalin have correctly explained these contradictions and correctly formulated the theory and tactics of the proletarian revolution for their resolution. Take the process of China's bourgeois democratic revolution, which began with the revolution of 1911. It, too, has several distinct stages, in particular, the revolution in its period of bourgeois leadership and revolution in its period of proletarian leadership represents two vastly different historical stages. In other words, the proletarian leadership has fundamentally changed the whole face of the revolution, has brought about a new alignment of the classes, given rise to a tremendous upsurge in the peasant revolution, imparted thoroughness to the revolution against imperialism and feudalism, created the possibility of the transition from the democratic revolution to the socialist revolution, and so on. None of these was possible in the period when the revolution was under bourgeois leadership. Although no change has taken place in the nature of the fundamental contradiction in the process, i.e., in the anti-imperialist, anti-feudal, democratic revolutionary nature of the process, the opposite of which is semi-colonial and semi-feudal nature. Nonetheless, this process has passed into several stages of development in the course of more than 20 years. During this time, many great events have taken place. The failure of the revolution in 1911 and the establishment of the regime of the northern warlords, the formation of the First National United Front and the revolution of 1924 to 27, the breakup of the United Front and the desertion of the bourgeois to the side of the counter-revolution, the war among the new warlords, the Agrarian Revolutionary War, the establishment of a Second National United Front, and the War of Resistance against Japan. These stages are marked by particular features, such as the intensification of certain contradictions, e.g., the Agrarian Revolutionary War and the Japanese invasion of the 4 northeastern provinces, the partial or temporary resolution of the other contradictions, e.g., the destruction of the northern warlords and our confiscation of the land of the landlords, and the emergence of yet other contradictions, e.g., the conflicts among the new warlords and the landlords' recapture of the land after the loss of our revolutionary base in the south. In studying the particularities of the contradictions at each stage in the process of development of a thing, we must not only observe them in their interconnections or their totality, we must also examine the two aspects of each contradiction. For example, consider the Kuomintang and the Communist Party. Take one aspect, the Kuomintang. In the period of the First United Front, the Kuomintang carried out Sun Yat-sen's 3 great policies of alliance with Russia, cooperation with the Communist Party, and assistance to the peasants and the workers. Hence, it was revolutionary and vigorous. It was an alliance of various classes for democratic revolution. After 1927, however, the Kuomintang changed it to its opposite and became a reactionary bloc of landlords and big bourgeois. After the Xi'an incident of December 1936, it began to change in the direction of ending the Civil War and cooperating with the Communist Party for joint opposition to the Japanese imperialism. Such have been the particular features of the Kuomintang in the 3 stages. Of course, these features have arisen from a variety of causes. Now take the other aspect, the Chinese Communist Party. In the first period of the United Front, the Chinese Communist Party was in its infancy. It courageously led the revolution in 1924 to 1927, but revealed its immaturity in its understanding of the character, the tasks, and methods of the revolution, and consequently became impossible for Chen Tuxian, to which appeared during the later period of this revolution, to assert itself and bring about the defeat of the revolution. After 1927, the Communist Party courageously led the Agrarian Revolutionary War and created the Revolutionary Army and the Revolutionary Base areas. However, it committed adventurous errors which brought about a very great loss both in the army and the base areas. Since 1935, the party has corrected these errors and has been leading the new United Front for resistance to Japan. This great struggle is now developing. At the present stage, the Communist Party is a party that has gone through the test of 2 revolutions and acquired a wealth of experience. Such have been the particular features of the Chinese Communist Party in the 3 stages. These features have, too, arisen from a variety of causes. Without studying both these sets of features, we cannot understand the particular relations between the 2 parties during the various stages of their development, namely the establishment of a United Front, the breakup of the United Front, and the establishment of another United Front. What is even more fundamental for the study of the particular features of the two parties is the examination of the class basis of the two parties and the resultant contradictions which have arisen between each party and other forces at different periods. For example, in the period of its first cooperation with the Chinese Communist Party, the Kuomintang stood in contradiction to foreign imperialism and was therefore anti-imperialist. On the other hand, it stood in contradiction to the great masses of the people within the country. Although in words it promised many benefits to the working people, in fact it gave them little or nothing. In the period when it carried on the anti-communist war, the Kuomintang collaborated with imperialism and feudalism against the great masses of the people and wiped out all the gains they had won in the revolution, thereby intensified its contradictions with them. In the present period of anti-Japanese war, the Kuomintang stands in contradiction to the Japanese imperialism and wants to cooperate with the Communist Party, without, however, relaxing its struggle against the Communist Party and the people or its oppression of them. As for the Communist Party, it has always been, in every period, stood with the great masses of the people against imperialism and feudalism, but in the present period of anti-Japanese war, it has adopted a moderate policy towards the Kuomintang and the domestic feudal forces because the Kuomintang have pressed itself in favor of resisting Japan. The above circumstances have resulted now in an alliance between the two parties and now in struggle between them, and even during these periods of alliance there has been a complicated state of simultaneous alliance and struggle. If we do not study the particular features of both aspects of contradiction, we shall fail to understand not only the relations of each party with the other forces, but also the relations between the two parties. It can thus be seen that in studying the particularity of any contradiction, the contradiction in each form of motion of matter, the contradiction in each of its processes of development, the two aspects of the contradiction in each process, the contradiction at each stage of a process, and the two aspects of the contradiction at each stage, in studying the particularity of all these contradictions, we must not be subjective and arbitrary, but must analyze it concretely. Without concrete analysis, there can be no knowledge of the particularity of any contradiction. We must always remember Lenin's words, the concrete analysis of concrete conditions. Marx and Engels were the first to provide us with an excellent model of such concrete analyses. When Marx and Engels applied the laws of contradictions and things to the study of socio-historical processes, they discovered the contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production. They discovered the contradiction between the exploiting classes and the exploited classes, and also the resultant contradiction between the economic base and its superstructure, politics, ideology, etc. And they discovered how these contradictions inevitably lead to different kinds of social revolution in different classes of society. When Marx applied this law to the study of economic structure of capitalist society, he discovered that the basic contradiction of the society is the contradiction between the social character of production and the private character of ownership. This contradiction manifests itself in the contradiction between the organized character of production in individual enterprises and the anarchic character of production in society as a whole. In terms of class relations, it manifests itself in the contradiction between the bourgeois and the proletariat. Because the range of things is vast and there is no limit to their development, what is universal in one context becomes particular in another. Conversely, what is particular in one context becomes universal in another. The contradiction in the capitalist system between the social character of production and the private ownership of the means of production is common to all countries where capitalism exists and develops. As far as capitalism is concerned, this constitutes the universality of contradiction. But this contradiction of capitalism belongs only to a certain historical stage in the general development of class society. As far as the contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production and class society as a whole is concerned, it constitutes the particularity of contradiction. However, in the course of dissecting the particularity of all these contradictions in capitalist society, Marx gave still a more profound, more adequate, and more complete elucidation of the universality of the contradiction between productive forces and the relations of production in class society in general. And so what Mao here is referring to is the German ideology, which is this excellent work by Marx and Engels, in which they analyze the origins of private property itself and class society itself. And I can just give you a very basic run through of that. It's basically that Marx and Engels saw the earliest hunter-gatherer societies in the Neolithic as primitive communists. So these were societies with low levels of productive forces, but their class relations were based on no private property whatsoever. However, as farming and agriculture evolved slowly and through slavery, the first private property came about in the forms of slave society and slave ownership. And in addition to suddenly the creation of private property, you also had the creation of classes. Some people owned more slaves than others. And so suddenly you needed a state in order to consolidate the rule of the ruling classes over the majority of the people who are ruled. Marx and Engels also traced one of the primary contradictions in class society as the difference between urban and rural centers. So the urban centers start to envelop and take in all of these resources from rural centers. Rural centers end up getting industrialized, degrowth, and become dependent on urban centers. And so that's why in full communism, they very much describe full communism as the breakdown between the development of urban and rural, and also the strict division of labor, which is also why Marx and Engels envisioned full communism, that stateless society, moneyless and everything, to also not have a division of labor, people being stuck within singular jobs. People will be free to go towards multiple occupations. Slave society transitioned into feudalism, where land was divided up. Feudalism saw guilds in some of the earliest capital, though it wasn't very highly developed movable capital. It was mostly fixed capital in the form of guild masters and their buildings and their tools. But as laborers moved into urban centers that were dispossessed within peasant lands and the merchant classes grew, out of this grew the need for the liberation of feudalism and eventually capitalism, and that highly developed capital, which found its origins within the guild masters. And so you can see how Marx and Engels were able to use capitalist society and use it to analyze the societies of the past, because capitalist society, just like any society, is birthed with the birthmarks of its past former grandfathers and grandmothers and great-great-grandmothers and so on. All the contradictions have weighed on each other and then resolved each other, in a continuous process. All right. Since the particular is united with the universal, and since the universality as well as the particularity of a contradiction is inherent in everything, universality residing in the particularity, we should, when studying an object, try to discover both the particular and the universal and their interconnection. To discover both the particularity and the universality, and also their interconnection within the object itself, and to discover the interconnections of this object with many objects outside of it. When Stalin explained the historical roots of Leninism in his famous work, The Foundations of Leninism, he analyzed the internal situation in which Leninism aroused, analyzed those contradictions of capitalism which reached their culmination under imperialism, and showed how these contradictions made proletarian revolution a matter for immediate action and created favorable conditions for direct onslaught on capitalism. What is more, he analyzed the reasons why Russia became the cradle of Leninism, why Tsarist Russia became the focus of all contradictions of imperialism, and why it's possible for the Russian proletariat to become the vanguard of the international revolutionary proletariat. Thus, Stalin analyzed the universality of contradiction in imperialism, showing why Leninism is the Marxism of the era of imperialism and proletarian revolution, and at the same time analyzed the particularity of the Tsarist Russian imperialism within this general contradiction, showing why Russia became the birthplace of the theory and tactics of the proletarian revolution, and how the universality of contradiction is contained in this particularity. Stalin's analysis provides us with a model for understanding the particularity and universality of contradiction and their interconnection. Yeah, so in the Foundations of Leninism, Stalin said one of the most important things about Tsarist Russia and why Lenin's analysis of Tsarist Russia was universal was because Tsarist Russia contained all the contradictions of global imperialist capitalism within it. So by analyzing the contradictions of Tsarist Russia, Lenin was also able to understand the world at large. Ultimately, all of the issues of world imperialist capitalism and that particular stage of capitalism were found within Tsarist Russia and late Tsarist Russia at that time, which allowed Lenin to analyze both the world at large and Russia itself. Russia was a microcosm of all of the issues of the world at large, similar to how the issues of Germany, when Marx and Engels were alive, when Germany was still transitioning from its feudal to its more capitalist stage, allowed Marx and Engels to analyze very universal laws through the microcosm of Germany. On the question of using dialectics in the study of objective phenomena, Marx and Engels, and likewise Lenin and Stalin, always enjoined people not to be in any way subjective and arbitrary, but from the concrete conditions in the actual objective movement of these phenomena to discover their concrete contradictions, the concrete position of each aspect of every contradiction, and the concrete interrelations of the contradictions. Our dogmatists do not have this attitude in study, and therefore can never get anything right. We must take warning from their failure and learn to acquire this attitude, which is the only correct one in study. The relationship between the universality and the particularity of a contradiction is a relationship between the general character and the individual character of contradiction. By the former, we mean that contradiction exists in and runs through all processes from beginning to end. Motion, things, processes, thinking are all contradictions. To deny contradiction is to deny everything. This is the universal truth for all times and all countries, which admits no exception. Hence the general character, the absoluteness of contradiction. But this general character is contained in every individual character. Without an individual character, there can be no general character. If all individual character were removed, what general character would remain? Is it because each contradiction is particular that an individual character arises? All individual character exists conditionally and temporarily, and hence is relative. This truth concerning general and individual character, concerning absoluteness and relativity, is quintessence of the problem of contradiction in things. Failure to understand it is tantamount to abandoning dialectics. The principal contradiction and the principal aspect of a contradiction. There are still 2 points in the problem of the particularity of contradiction which must be singled out for analysis, namely the principal contradiction and the principal aspects of a contradiction. There are many contradictions in the process of the development of a complex thing, and one of them is necessarily the principal contradiction whose existence and development determine or influence the existence and development of other contradictions. For instance, in capitalist society, the 2 forces in contradiction, the proletariat and the bourgeois, form the principal contradiction. The other contradictions, such as those between the remnant feudal class and the bourgeoisie, between the petty bourgeois and the bourgeois, between the proletariat and the peasant petty bourgeois, between the non-monopoly capitalists and the monopoly capitalists, between bourgeois democracy and bourgeois fascism, among the capitalist countries and between the imperialism and the colonies, are all determined or influenced by this principal contradiction. In a semi-colonial country such as China, the relationship between the principal contradiction and the non-principal contradictions present a complicated picture. When imperialism launches a war of aggression against such a country, all in its various classes, except for some traders, can temporarily unite in a national war against imperialism. At such a time, the contradiction between imperialism and the country concerned becomes the principal contradiction, while all the contradictions among the various classes within the country, including what was the principal contradiction between the feudal system and the great masses of the people, are temporarily relegated to the secondary and subordinate position. So it was in China in the Opium War of 1840, the Sino-Japanese War in 1894, and the Yuhutan War of 1900, and so it is now in the present Sino-Japanese War. But in another situation, the contradictions change position. When imperialism carries on its oppression not by war, but by a milder means, political, economic, and cultural, the ruling classes in semi-colonial countries capitulate to imperialism, and the 2 form an alliance for the joint oppression of the mass of people. But in another situation, the contradictions change position. When imperialism carries on its oppression, not by war but by milder means, political, economic, and cultural, the ruling classes in semi-colonial countries capitulate to imperialism, and the 2 form an alliance for the joint oppression of the masses of the people. At the same time, the masses often resort to civil war against the alliance of the imperialism and the feudal classes, while imperialism often employs indirect methods rather than direct action in helping the reactionaries in the semi-colonial countries to oppose the people, and thus the internal contradictions become particularly sharp. This is what happened in China in the Revolutionary War of 1911, and the Revolutionary War of 1924 to 1927, and 10 years of the Agrarian Revolutionary War after 1927. Wars among the various reactionary ruling groups in the semi-colonial countries, e.g., the wars among the warlords in China, fall into the same category. When a revolutionary civil war develops to the point of threatening the very existence of imperialism and its running dogs, the domestic reactionaries, imperialism often adopts other methods in order to maintain its rule. It either tries to split the revolutionary front from within or sends armed forces to help the domestic reactionaries directly. At the same time, foreign imperialism and domestic reaction stand quite openly at one pole, while the masses of the people stand at the other pole, thus reforming the principal contradiction which determines or influences the development of the other contradictions. The assistance given by various capitalist countries to Russian reactionaries after the October Revolution is an example of armed intervention. Chiang Kai-shek's betrayal in 1927 is an example of splitting of the revolutionary front. But whatever happens, there is no doubt that at every stage in the development of a process, there is only one principal contradiction which plays the leading role. Hence, if in any process there are a number of contradictions, one of them must be the principal contradiction playing the leading and decisive role, while the rest occupy a secondary and subordinate position. Therefore, in studying any complex process in which there are two or more contradictions, we must devote every effort to finding its principal contradiction. Once this principal contradiction is grasped, all problems can readily be solved. This is the method Marx taught us in the study of capitalist society. Likewise, Lenin and Stalin taught us this method when they studied imperialism and the general crisis of capitalism, and when they studied the Soviet economy. There are thousands of scholars and men of action who do not understand it, and the result is that, lost in fog, they are unable to get to the heart of the problem and naturally cannot find a way to resolve its contradictions. As we have said, one must not treat all contradictions in the process as being equal, but must distinguish between principal and secondary contradictions and pay special attention to grasping the principal one. But in any given contradiction, whether principal or secondary, should the two contradictory aspects be treated as equal? Again, no. In any contradiction, the development of the contradiction aspects is uneven. Sometimes they seem to be in equilibrium, which is, however, only temporary and relative, while unevenness is basic. Of the two contradictory aspects, one must be principal and the other secondary. The principal aspect is the one playing the leading role in contradiction. The nature of a thing is determined mainly by the principal aspect of a contradiction, the aspect which has gained the dominant position. But this situation is not static. The principal and the non-principal aspects of a contradiction transform themselves into each other, and the nature of a thing changes accordingly. In a given process or at a given stage in the development of contradiction, A is the principal aspect and B is the non-principal aspect. At another stage or in another process, the roles are reversed. A change is determined by the extent of the increase or decrease in the force of the aspect in its struggle against the other in the course of the development of a thing. We often speak of the new superseding the old. The suppression of the old by the new is general, eternal, and an inevitable law of the universe. The transformation of one thing into another through leaps of different forms in accordance with its existence and external conditions, this is the process of the new superseding the old. In each thing there is a contradiction between its new and its old aspects, and this gives rise to a series of struggles with many twists and turns. As a result of these struggles, the new aspect changes from being minor to being major and rises in predominance, while the old aspect changes from being a major to being a minor and gradually dies out. And the moment the new aspect gains dominance over the old thing changes qualitatively into the new thing. It can thus be seen that the nature of a thing is mainly determined by the principal aspect of the contradiction, the aspect which has gained prominence. When the principal aspect which has gained prominence changes, the nature of a thing changes accordingly. In capitalist society, capitalism has changed its position from being the subordinate force in the old feudal era to being the dominant force, and the nature of society has accordingly changed from feudal to capitalist. In the new era, the capitalist era, the feudal forces have changed from their former dominant position to a subordinate one, gradually dying out. Such was the case, for example, in Britain and France. With the development of the productive forces, the bourgeois changes from being the new class playing a progressive role to being an old class playing a reactionary role, until it is finally overthrown by the proletariat and becomes a class deprived of privately owned means of production and stripped of power, when it too gradually dies out. The proletariat, which is much more numerous than the bourgeois and grows simultaneously with it under its rule, is a new force which, initially subordinate to the bourgeois, gradually gains strength, becomes an independent class playing the leading role in history, and finally seizes political power and becomes the ruling class. Thereupon the nature of society changes and the old capitalist society becomes the new socialist society. This is the path already taken by the Soviet Union, a path that all countries will inevitably take. Look at China, for instance. Imperialism occupies the principal position in the contradiction in which China has been reduced to a semi-colony. It oppresses the Chinese people, and China has been changed from an independent country into a semi-colonial one. But this state of affairs will inevitably change. In the struggle between the two sides, the power of the Chinese people, which is growing under the leadership of the proletariat, will inevitably change China from a semi-colony into an independent country, whereas imperialism will be overthrown and old China will inevitably change into new China. The change of old China into new China also involves a change in the relation between the old feudal forces and the new popular forces within the country. The old feudal landlords will be overthrown, and from being a ruler, it will change into being the ruled, and this class too will eventually die out. From being ruled, the people led by the proletariat will become the rulers. Thereupon, the nature of Chinese society will change, and the old semi-colonial and semi-feudal society will be changed into a new democratic society. Instances of the reciprocal transformation are found in our past experiences. The Qing dynasty, which has ruled China for nearly 300 years, was overthrown in the Revolution of 1911, and the revolutionary Teng Meng-Huai, under Sun Yat-sen's leadership, was victorious for a time. In the Revolutionary War of 1924-27, the revolutionary forces of the Communist Kuomintang alliance in the south changed from being weak to being strong and won victory in the Northern Expedition, while the northern landlords who once ruled the roost were overthrown. In 1927, the People's Forces led by the Communist Party were greatly reduced numerically under the attacks of the Kuomintang reaction. But with the elimination of opportunism within their ranks, they gradually grew again. In the revolutionary base areas under communist leadership, the peasants have been transformed from being ruled into rulers, while landlords have undergone a reverse transformation. It is always so in the world, the new displacing the old being superseded by the old being eliminated to make way for the new, and the new emerging out of the old. At certain times in the revolutionary struggle, the difficulties outweigh the favorable conditions, and so constitute the principal aspect of the contradiction, and the favorable conditions constitute the secondary aspect. But through their efforts, the revolutionaries can overcome the difficulties step by step, and open up the favorable new situation. Thus, a difficult situation yields place to a favorable one. This is what happened after the failure of the revolution in China in 1927 and during the Long March of the Chinese Red Army. In the present Sino-Japanese War, China is again in a difficult position, but we can change this fundamentally, and fundamentally transform the situation as between China and Japan. Conversely, favorable conditions can be transformed into difficulty if the revolutionaries make mistakes. Thus, the victory of revolution of 1924-27 turned into defeat. The revolutionary base areas which grew up in the southern provinces after 1927 had all suffered defeat by 1934. When we engage in study, the same holds good for the contradiction in the passage from ignorance to knowledge. At the very beginning of our study of Marxism, our ignorance of scanty acquaintance with Marxism stands in contradiction to the knowledge of Marxism. But by assiduous study, ignorance can be transformed into knowledge, scanty knowledge into substantial knowledge, and blindness in the application of Marxism into mastery in this application. Some people think that this is not true of certain contradictions. For instance, in the contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production, the productive forces are the principal aspect. In the contradiction between theory and practice, practice is the principal aspect. In the contradiction between the economic base and the superstructure, the economic base is the principal aspect. And there is no change in the respective positions. This is the mechanical materialist conception, not the dialectical materialist conception. True, the productive forces, practice, and economic base generally play the principal and decisive role. Whoever denies this is not a materialist. But it is also must be admitted that in certain conditions, such aspects as the relations of production, theory, and superstructure in turn manifest themselves in the principal and decisive role. Okay, so basically what he's saying here is that some people basically believe that the entirety of the world is based off of things in this base of society, right? So this is the economy, the modes of production. So that is the basis of everything. And things in the superstructure of society, right? Political ideologies, governments, things like that, never actually play a role in the material world, right? And Mao saying, no. They do sometimes play the principal contradiction. They do sometimes play the material role. I mean, for instance, liberalism, when in charge of the government, does materially change the world, right? You know, an ideology, when in charge of a system. This is also the debate between Maoism and Dengism. Dengism oftentimes, and I do feel this, falls way too overly into mechanical dialectics, where it simply believes that productive forces will somehow magically change the relations of society. Productive forces being the technological development, relations of production, which is how these technological developments are set up, sometimes have led to industrialization. Like when China became communist or Russia became communist, that shift in ideology radically changed the material world, right? Didn't magically, but it radically changed the industrial level of these societies and made them behemoths, right? So some people overly rely on the base of society, which is the economic mode of production, and also the productive forces, which is the level of technological development, and less on the relations of production. Of course, Dungus will argue that China does maintain proletarian relations of production. It's a very rich debate. I'm not going to get into it right now. That's just a small critique I see Maoists throw at Dungus, and then Dungus will throw critiques back, But moving on, does materially change the world and make differences. So that's basically what he's saying. The mechanists basically over-rely on the base of society, right? The economic mode of society being the basis for everything. In studying the particularity of a contradiction, unless we examine these two facets, the principal and non-principal contradictions in a process, and the principal and non-principal aspects of a contradiction, that is, unless we examine the distinctive character of these two facets of contradiction, we shall get bogged down in abstractions, be unable to understand the contradiction concretely, and consequently be unable to find the correct method of resolving it. The distinctive character of a particularity of these two facets of contradiction represents the unevenness of the force that are in contradiction. Nothing in the world develops absolutely evenly. We must oppose the theory of even development or the theory of equilibrium. Moreover, it is these concrete features of a contradiction and the changes in the principal and non-principal aspects of a contradiction in the course of its development that manifest the force of the new superseding the old. The study of the various states of unevenness in contradictions and the principal and non-principal contradictions and of the principal and non-principal aspects of a contradiction constitutes an essential method by which the revolutionary political party correctly determines its strategic and tactical policies, both in political and military affairs. All communists must give it attention. The identity and struggle of the aspects of a contradiction. When we understand the universality and the particularity of a contradiction, we must proceed to study the problem of the identity and the struggle of the aspect of a contradiction. Identity, unity, coincidence, interpenetration, interpermeation, interdependence, or mutual dependence for existence, interconnection, or mutual cooperation. All of these different terms mean the same thing and refer to the following 2 points. First, the existence of each of the two aspects of a contradiction is the process of the development of a thing, presupposes the existence of the other aspect, and both aspects coexist in a single entity. Second, in given conditions, each of the two contradictory aspects transforms itself into the opposite. This is the meaning of identity. Lenin said, "Dialectics is the teaching which shows how opposites can be and how they can happen to be, how they become identical, under what conditions they are identical, transforming themselves into one another. Why the human mind should take these opposites not as dead, rigid, but as living, conditional, mobile, transforming themselves into the other." What does this passage mean? The contradictory aspects in every process exclude each other, struggle with each other, and are in opposition to each other. Without exception, they are contained in the process of the development of all things and in all human thought. A simple process contains only a pair of opposites, while a complex process contains more, and in turn the pair of opposites are in contradiction to one another. That is how all things in the objective world and all human thought are constituted and how they are set in motion. This being so, there is an utter lack of identity or unity. How then can one speak of identity or unity? The fact is that no contradictory aspect can exist in isolation. Without its opposite aspect, each loses the condition for its existence. Just think, can any one contradictory aspect of a thing or a concept in the human mind exist independently? Without life, there would be no death. Without death, there would be no life. Without above, there would be no below. Without below, there would be no above. Without misfortune, there would be no good fortune. Without good fortune, there would be no misfortune. Without facility, there would be no difficulty. Without difficulty, there would be no facility. Without landlords, there would be no tenant peasants. Without tenant peasants, there would be no landlords. Without the bourgeois, there would be no proletariat. Without the proletariat, there would be no bourgeois. Without the imperialist oppression of nations, there would be no colonies or semi-colonies. Without the colonies or semi-colonies, there would be no imperialist oppression of nations. It is so with all opposites in given conditions. One hand, they are opposed to each other, and on the other, they are interconnected, interpenetrating, intermediating, and interdependent. And this character is described as identity. In given conditions, all contradictory aspects possess the character of non-identity, and hence are described as being in contradiction. But they also possess the character of identity, and hence are interconnected. This is what Lenin means when he says that dialectic studies how opposites can be identical. How then can they be identical? Because each is the condition for the other's existence. This is the first meaning of identity. But is it not enough to merely say that each of the contradictory aspects is a condition for the other's existence, that there is identity between them and that consequently they can exist in a single entity? No, it is not. The matter does not end with their dependence on each other for their existence. What is more important is their transformation into each other. That is to say, in given conditions, each of the contradictory aspects within a thing transforms itself into its opposites, changes its position to that of its opposite. This is the second meaning of the identity of contradiction. Why is there identity here too? You see, by the means of revolution, the proletariat, at one time the ruled, is transformed into the ruler, while the bourgeois, the erstwhile ruler, is transformed into the ruled, and changes its position to that originally occupied by its opposite. This has already taken place in the Soviet Union, as it will take place throughout the world. If there was no interconnection and identity of opposites in given conditions, how could such a change take place? The Kuomintang, which played a very certain positive role at a certain stage in modern Chinese history, became a counter-revolutionary party after 1927 because of its inherent class nature and because of the imperialist blandishments, these being the conditions. But it has been compelled to agree to resist Japan because of the sharpening of the contradiction between China and Japan, and because of the Communist Party's policy of the United Front, these being the conditions. Things in contradiction change into one another, and herein lies the definitive identity. Our agrarian revolution has been a process in which the landlord class owning the land is transformed into a class that has lost the land, while the peasants, which once lost their lands, are transformed into small holders who've acquired land, and it will be such a process once again. In given conditions, having and not having, acquiring and losing are interconnected. There is an identity between both sides. Under socialism, private peasant ownership is transformed into public ownership of socialist agriculture. This has already taken place in the Soviet Union, as it will take place elsewhere. There is a bridge leading from private property to public property, which philosophy is called identity, or transformation into each other, or interpenetration. To consolidate the dictatorship of the proletariat, or the dictatorship of the people, is in fact to prepare the conditions for the abolishment of this dictatorship and advancing to the higher stage when all state systems are eliminated. To establish and build the Communist Party is in fact to prepare the conditions for the elimination of the Communist Party and all political parties. To build a revolutionary army under the leadership of the Communist Party and to carry on revolutionary war is in fact to prepare the conditions for the permanent elimination of war. These opposites are at the same time complementary. War and peace, as everybody knows, transforms themselves into each other. War is transformed into peace. For instance, in the First World War, it was transformed into a post-war peace, and the civil war in China is now stopped, giving place to an internal peace. Peace is transformed into war. For instance, the Kuomintang Communist Cooperation was transformed into war in 1927, and today's situation of world peace may be transitioned into a Second World War. Why is this so? Because in class society, such contradictory things as war and peace have an identity in given conditions. All contradictory things are interconnected. Not only do they coexist in a single entity in given conditions, but in other given conditions. They also transform themselves into each other. This is the full meaning of the identity of opposites. This is what Lenin meant when he said, quote, how they happen to be identical, under what conditions they are identical, transforming themselves into one another, end quote. Why is it that, quote, the human mind should take these opposites not as dead, rigid, but as living, conditional, mobile, transforming themselves into one another, end quote? Because this is just how things are in objective reality. The fact of the matter is that the unity of identity or of opposites in objective things is not dead or rigid, but is living, conditional, mobile, temporary, and relative in given conditions. Every contradictory aspect transforms itself into its opposite. Reflected in man's thinking, this becomes the Marxist world outlook of materialist dialectics. It is not only the reactionary ruling classes of the past and the present, and the metaphysicians in their service who regard opposites not as living, conditional, mobile, and transforming themselves into one another, but as dead and rigid. And they propagate this fallacy everywhere to delude the masses of people, thus seeking to perpetuate their role. The tasks of communists is to expose the fallacies of reactionaries and metaphysicians, to propagate the dialectics inherent in things, and so accelerate the transformation of things and achieve the goal of revolution. In speaking of the identity of opposites in given conditions, what we are referring to is real and concrete opposites and the real and concrete transformations of opposites into one another. There are innumerable transformations in mythology. For instance, Ku Fua's race in the sun in Shan Huang Qing, Yi shooting down of the nine suns in Hua Nan Su, the Monkey King's 72 metamorphoses in Xiu Yu Qi, the numerous episodes of ghosts and foxes metamorphosized into human beings in the strange tales of Lao Qi. But these legendary transformations of opposites are not concrete changes reflecting concrete contradictions. They are naive, imaginary, subjectively conceived transformations conjured up in men's minds by innumerable real and complex transformations of opposites into one another. Marx said, quote, all mythology masters and dominates and shapes the forces of nature in and through the imagination. Hence it disappears as soon as man gains mastery over the forces of nature, end quote. The myriads of changes in mythology, and also in nursery tales, delight people because they are imaginatively picture man's conquest of the forces of nature, and the best myths possess, quote, eternal charm, end quote, as Marx put it. But myths are not built out of the concrete conditions existing in given conditions, and are therefore not a scientific reflection of reality. That is to say, in myths or nursery tales, the aspects of constituting a contradiction have only an imaginary identity, not a concrete identity. The scientific reflection of identity in real transformations is Marxist dialectics. Why can an egg but not a stone be transformed into a chicken? Why is there an identity between war and peace and not between war and a stone? Why can human beings give birth to only human beings and not anything else? The sole reason is that the identity of opposites only exists in necessary given conditions. Without these necessary given conditions, there could be no identity whatsoever. Why is it that in Russia in 1917, the bourgeois democratic February Revolution was directly linked with the proletarian socialist October Revolution, while in France the bourgeois revolution was not directly linked with the socialist revolution, and the Paris Commune of 1871 ended in failure? Why is it, on the other hand, that the nomadic system of Mongolia and Central Asia have been directly linked with socialism? Why is it that the Chinese Revolution can avoid a capitalist failure and be directly linked with the socialism without taking the old historical road of Western countries, without passing through a period of bourgeois dictatorship? The sole reason is the concrete conditions of the time. When necessary conditions are present, certain contradictions arise in the process of development of things, and moreover, the opposite contained in them are interdependent and become transformed into one another. Otherwise, none of this would be possible. Such is the problem of identity. What then is struggle? And what is the reflection between identity and struggle? Lenin said, quote, the unity, coincidence, identity, equal action of opposites is conditional, temporary, transitory, relative. The struggle of mutually exclusive opposites is absolute, just as development and motion are absolute. What does this passage mean? All processes have a beginning and an end. All processes transform themselves into their opposites. The constancy of a process is relative, but the mutability manifested in transformation of one process into another is absolute. There are two states of motion in all things, that of relative rest and that of conspicuous change. Both are caused by the struggle between the two contradictory elements contained in a thing. When the thing is in the first state of motion, it is undergoing only quantitative and not qualitative change, and consequently presents the outward appearance of being at rest. When the thing is in the second state of motion, the quantitative change of the first state has already been reached, a culminating point, and gives rise to the dissolution of a thing as an entity, and thereupon a qualitative change ensues. Hence the appearance of a conspicuous change. Such unity, solidarity, combination, harmony, balance, stalemate, deadlock, rest, constancy, equilibrium, solidity, attraction, etc., as we see in daily life, are all the appearance of things in the state of quantitative change. On the other hand, the dissolution of unity, that is, the destruction of the solidarity, combination, harmony, balance, stalemate, deadlock, rest, constancy, equilibrium, solidarity and attraction, and the change of each other into its opposites are all the appearances of things in the state of qualitative change, the transformation of one process into another. Things are constantly transforming themselves from the first into the second state of motion. The struggle of opposites goes on in both states, but the contradiction is resolved through the second state. That is why we say the unity of opposites is conditional, temporary, and relative, while the struggle of mutually exclusive opposites is absolute. When we said above that the two opposite things can coexist in a single entity and can transform themselves into each other because there is identity between them, we were speaking of conditionality. That is to say, in given conditions, two contradictory things can be united and transform themselves into each other. But in absence of these conditions, they cannot constitute a contradiction, cannot coexist in the same entity, and cannot transform themselves into one another. It is because the identity of opposites obtains only in given conditions that we have said identity is conditional and relative. We may add that the struggle between opposites permeates a process from beginning to end and makes one process transform itself into another, that it is ubiquitous, and the struggle is therefore unconditional and absolute. The combination of conditional relative identity and an unconditional absolute struggle constitutes the movement of opposites in all things. We Chinese often say, things that oppose each other are also complement each other. That is, things opposed to each other have identity. This saying is dialectical and contrary to metaphysics. Oppose each other refers to the mutual exclusion or the struggle between two contradictory aspects. Complement each other means that in given conditions, the two contradictory aspects unite and achieve identity. Yet struggle is inherent in identity, and without struggle there can be no identity. In identity there is struggle, in particularity there is universality, and in individuality there is generality. To quote Lenin, there is an absolute in the relative. The place of antagonism and contradiction. The question of the struggle of opposites includes the question of what is antagonism. Our answer is that antagonism is one form, but not the only form, of struggle of opposites. In human history, antagonism between classes exists as a particular manifestation of the struggle of opposites. Consider the contradiction between the exploiting and the exploited classes. Such contradictory classes coexist for a long time in the same society, be it slave society, feudal society, or capitalist society, and they struggle with each other. But it's not until the contradiction between the two classes develops to a certain stage that it assumes the form of open antagonism and develops into revolution. The same holds for the transformation of peace into war in class society. Before it explodes, a bomb is a single entity in which opposites coexist in given conditions. The explosion takes place only when a new condition, ignition, is present. Banger example. An analogous situation arises in all those natural phenomena which finally assume the form of open conflict to resolve old contradictions and produce new things. It is highly important to grasp this fact. It enables us to understand that revolutions and revolutionary wars are inevitable in class society, and that without them it is impossible to accomplish any leap in social development and to overthrow the reactionary ruling classes, and therefore impossible for people to win political power. Communists must expose the deceitful propaganda of reactionaries, such as the assertion that social revolution is unnecessary and impossible. They must firmly uphold the Marxist-Leninist theory of social revolution and enable the people to understand that social revolution is not entirely necessary, but also entirely practicable, and that the whole of history of mankind and the triumph of the Soviet Union have confirmed this scientific truth. However, we must make concrete study of the circumstances of each specific struggle of opposites and should not arbitrarily apply the formulas discussed above to everything. Contradiction and struggle are universal and absolute, but the methods of resolving contradictions, that is, the forms of struggle, differ according to the differences in nature of contradictions. Some contradictions are characterized by open antagonism, others are not. In accordance with concrete development of things, some contradictions which were originally non-antagonistic develop into antagonistic ones, while others which were originally antagonistic develop into non-antagonistic ones. As already mentioned, so long as classes exist, contradictions between correct and incorrect ideas of communist parties are reflections of within the party of class contradiction. At first, with regard to certain issues, such contradictions may not manifest themselves as antagonistic, but with the development of the class struggle, they may grow and become antagonistic. The history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union shows that the contradictions between the correct thinking of Lenin and Stalin and the fallacious thinking of Trotsky, Bukharin, and others did not at first manifest themselves into an antagonistic form, but that later they did develop into antagonism. There are similar cases in the history of the Chinese Communist Party. At first, the contradictions between the correct thinking of many of our party comrades and the fallacious thinking of Chen Qiuhua and Chang Huatua and others also did not manifest themselves into antagonistic forms, but later they did develop into antagonisms. At present, the contradiction between the correct and incorrect thinking in our party does not manifest itself into an antagonistic form, and if the comrades who have committed mistakes can correct them, it will not develop into antagonism. Therefore, the party must, on the one hand, wage a serious struggle against erroneous thinking, and on the other, give the comrades who have committed errors ample opportunity to wake up. This being the case, excessive struggle is obviously inappropriate, but if the people who have committed errors persist in them and aggravate them, there's a possibility that this contradiction will develop into antagonism. Economically, the contradiction between town and country is an extremely antagonistic one, both in capitalist society, where under the rule of bourgeois, the towns ruthlessly plunder the countryside, and in Kuomintang areas in China, where under the rule of foreign imperialism and the Chinese big comprador bourgeois, the towns most rapaciously plunder the countryside. But in socialist country and in our revolutionary base areas, this antagonistic contradiction has changed into one that is non-antagonistic, and when communist society is reached, it will be abolished. Lenin said, quote, "Antagonism and contradiction are not all one and the same. Under socialism, the first will disappear, the second will remain," end quote. That is to say, antagonism is one form, but not the only form of the struggle of opposites. The formula of antagonism cannot be arbitrarily applied everywhere. Conclusion. We may now say a few words to sum up. The law of contradiction in things, that is, the law of the unity of opposites, is the fundamental law of nature and of society, and therefore also the fundamental law of thought. It stands opposed to metaphysical world outlooks. It represents a great revolution in the history of human knowledge. According to dialectical materialism, contradiction is present in all processes of objectively existing things and of subjective thought, and permeates all processes from beginning to end. This is the universality and absoluteness of contradiction. Each contradiction and each of its aspects have their respective characteristics. This is the particularity and relativity of contradiction. In given conditions, opposites possess identity, and can coexist in a single entity and can transform themselves into each other. This again is the particularity and relativity of contradiction. But the struggle of opposites is ceaseless. It goes on both when the opposites are coexisting and when they are transforming themselves into each other, and becomes especially conspicuous when they are transforming themselves into one another. This again is the universality and absoluteness of contradiction. In studying the particularity and the relativity of contradiction, and the struggle of opposites in contradiction, we must give attention to the distinction between different forms of struggle. Otherwise, we shall make mistakes. If we, through study, achieve a real understanding of the essentials explained above, we shall be able to demolish dogmatist ideas which are contrary to the basic principles of Marxist-Leninism and detrimental to a revolutionary cause, and our comrades with practical experience will be able to organize their experience into principles and avoiding repeating empiricist errors. These are a few simple conclusions from our study of the law of contradiction. And that was On Contradiction by Mao Zedong, a beautiful explanation of Hegelian philosophy, metaphysics, materialism, how Marx and Engels took that Hegelian abstraction of the world, but still used that framework and made it an inverse for their materialism and dialectics. A perfect explanation of how Marxism and Marx saw the moving of history forward through contradiction and the struggle of this contradiction, and how even we get to these identities and contradiction and how we label them. Honestly, On Contradiction is probably one of the greatest theoretical works of the 20th century. It summarizes thousands of years of philosophical trends, right? Hegelianism, it summarizes metaphysics, it summarizes dialectical materialism and historical materialism, and the Marxist framework and Leninism and Stalin's contributions to Marxist theory. It's able to synthesize them and explain them in a way that even a peasant, even somebody who's relatively uneducated, could understand very easily. I know within my recording I fucked up a few words here or there, a few sentences here or there. I know that I fucked up the Chinese. I fucked up the Chinese pronunciation, definitely. But I hope you had as much fun listening along and reading this text as much as I did reading it. This is truly a treat. Mao was such an excellent writer. He really is. Engels, right? Marx was very good at analyzing the world. Marx was very good at critiquing the world. Marx was very good at breaking down complex parts of the world into critiques and analyses and, threading these little threads in the world. But he was very bad at explaining them. Marx's writing is very overly mechanical. Marx's writing is very overly stuck within his 19th century language, pompous, academic. Engels was very good at simplifying a lot of Marx's ideas into very clear words. And I think Mao and Stalin, if you've ever read Stalin too, were very good at even further simplifying Marxist and Leninist ideas in ways that your average Joe Schmo can understand. And there is a need for academic language, and there is a need for academic pomp and things like that. And of course, Marx was a very funny writer. If you read his work, he's constantly cracking jokes that don't hit as much in the modern day, admittedly, but he was good. He was funny, or at least he attempted to be funny. But we need a lot more writers like Mao and Stalin who are able to take these very complex ideas and simplify them into ways that your average Joe Schmo can understand. As much as we need, academic Marxists, we also need Marxists who are able to do what Mao did with this text. It's a treat to read. It's truly great. Go to marxist.com.org, check it out for yourself, read along with this again, read his works, read On Practice. It's amazing. Thank you, Mao Zedong.